Thanks for having me here. I just want to try an experiment. If I put this down and use the lecture voice, can you hear me? Yeah. All right, awesome. I'll do that. So my name is Mehran. I think like Professor Sahami is way too formal and Mr. Sahami is too formal. I think of Mr. Sahami is my dad. And so Mrs. Sahami is my mom. You can just call me Mehran. And I like to be pretty informal. And as we sort of go along, I'll tell you some stories and stuff like that. If you have questions or whatever, just feel free to raise your hand or just chime in. So I'm not a big fan of formality. And I was thinking, if we just kind of have a little time chatting together this evening, hopefully, it will be more fun for both of us. So what I wanted to spend a little bit of time doing is tell you a little bit about some stuff that's going on in terms of research in computer science and things that are going on in education. All right, better? All right, will do. So I'll tell you some stories and along the way tell you a little bit about background and things like that. But what I really wanted to start with is there's this quote that I find sort of magical in some ways, which is, anyone know Arthur C. Clarke, who Arthur C. Clarke is? Science fiction author, wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey, among other things. He had this quote, which was, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which sounds kind of weird when you first hear it. But, any Harry Potter fans in here, by the way? Wondering a few. I'm a big one. I'm reading it to my kids now, so I get to go through it a second time. But one of the things I think is really interesting is, if 100 years ago, if you told someone that there would be a device that's roughly about yay big and you can hold it up to your ear and talk to anyone else on the planet instantly, it would have seemed like magic, right? It would have seemed like, how is that possible? And it turns out now, the way we think about it is, it's not magic, it's technology. And that's the idea. When technology gets sufficiently far, the things we can do with it are things that we could not conceive were possible before. And so the only explanation we would have had for them before was they were magic. And that's what I try to tell my students is that, it would be nice if a place like Hogwarts existed and we could really do magic. But if you want to do magic, what you should really learn about is science and technology, because that's what will turn you into the magician of the 21st century. And so one of the things, I'll show you a couple examples. I'll show you one little video. This is work that was done a couple years ago at Stanford. And it's the idea of having a particular kind of camera. And so, wouldn't it be interesting if you could have a camera and take a particular picture with it, and then after the fact, just refocus the picture anywhere you wanted, right? So that's one picture. And you could do that with a bunch of things. So you take a blurry picture, you just refocus it afterwards. Or, you're like my, 7-year-old daughter, you take a really bad picture, that's fine too, that can be fixed. You take a picture through a translucent material like water, that's fine, you can focus through that too. Right? And so the idea is that this isn't necessarily something that's going to change your life. And here's one with color and, we got crayons in there. I always like to say this is kind of fun because, if you take a picture and then after the fact there's some person you want to remove from that picture, you can just blur them out a lot more nicely. It's not magic that's going to change your life, but it sort of shows you something that is one of the steps you can take with technology. And what that really is what's known as a light field camera. And the observation was when you take a picture, rather than just taking a picture of the standard way cameras do, where they have a little focal plane in there and photons or bits of light come in, they hit that focal plane, it takes a picture. What if you sampled all of the light radiating from some source? Then after the fact, you sort of computationally figure out where your focal plane would be, and you can put that wherever you want, and then that's equivalent to basically focusing the picture anywhere there. And that turns into a computer science problem, right? At that point, it's not about physics or optics anymore. Part of it's understanding how the optics and light work. But once you get all that information from an object, it becomes a computational problem to figure out how to do that refocusing. Here's a little bit of magic that may change your life, actually likely will. Anyone know what that is? Self-driving car. These days, especially when you're in Silicon Valley, right, everyone's like, self-driving cars, like second nature, right? There's certain places in the country show that picture and they're like, it's like a NASCAR with some stuff on top, okay? Because it's got all those corporate logos. In fact, the way we think about this, it's a robot, right? It's a robot that happens to have the form factor of an automobile, namely it's got wheels, and there's a steering wheel inside because some human could potentially drive it, but there's a bunch of computers in the back that actually drive it. Okay? And I'll show you this video of what this is as a computational problem. So this is something called the DARPA Urban Grand Challenge, which happened a few years back. The idea was, could a car autonomously drive in an urban environment by itself? So recognize particular intersections, know when it was its turn to go, because it reasons about the rules of the road. All the humans are behind concrete bunkers in these movies, which is kind of interesting, but it's getting better. This is from a few years back. So here is the car, comes to an intersection, has to recognize that there's other cars in that intersection. It has to do some reasoning about what are the rules of the road, when is its turn to go, be able to detect when other cars have cleared the intersection, and understand that when it's its turn to go, it finally applies some acceleration and then moves through the intersection when it's its turn, okay? And part of that is, what does that mean as a computational problem, okay? Here's what that means as a computational problem. This is in some sense what the car sees, and sees is basically some combination of laser rangefinders and other things. The red dots are places where it believes there's some sort of block. It recognizes certain groups of blocks as being cars. It recognizes that this is an intersection, and then when a certain car clears the intersection, you notice it puts a little green bar there to indicate that that car has taken its turn, so it can reason about the rules of the road. And finally, when it realizes in that intersection it's now its turn to go, even though another car has pulled up in the meantime, it doesn't sit there until the intersection is completely clear. It figures out it's its turn to go and then moves through the intersection. Okay? And that needs to be able to work in a variety of situations. So if it comes to an intersection and no one's there, it should be able to recognize that, and after it comes to a stop, recognize that it's its turn to go and be able to go through. Sometimes also when you're planning routes, sometimes your route's blocked. So here it wanted to go down the street, and you can see there's a bunch of those little red blocks. We don't know what that is. It could have been construction, could be people crossing the road. It's something where it can't go through. And so it needs to recognize that, and it needs to then do what I would like to think of as a 3-point turn. It's really an n-point turn, where n is some number larger than 3. But it eventually figures out it can't go through that way, so it needs to turn itself around and then find some other path, right? Finding the path's the easy part. We all use like mapping applications to find paths. Being able to recognize that something's blocked and then do the reasoning to figure out it needs to do something else and then take those action becomes the computational problem, which is more difficult, okay? And that's one of the things that, you know, among many others that are involved in the notion of driving. And so this video goes on for a bit. I'm just going to stop it here. But in terms of how this impacts you, to talk a little bit about that. So Sebastian Thrun, who's a professor at Stanford and also does a bunch of other things, I don't know how he pulls it off, but he was also a research scientist at Google and also started this company called Udacity to do online education. I had this quote a couple years back, which was, it's a no-brainer that in 50 to 60 years from now, cars will drive themselves. Okay? And at the time he said this, which was just basically 5 years ago, a little less than 5 years ago, people thought that was outrageous. How can cars drive themselves in 50 to 60 years? Okay? It's been less than 5 years since he said that quote, and now people think 50 to 60 years out, yeah, that's too far out. You know, we'll probably get self-driving cars before then, right? There are some people anticipating on the 10 to 20 year time frame. So this will certainly impact you in your lifetime, okay? And if you think about the notion of self-driving cars, there's a bunch of things that come up. And one thing I'll actually share with you is policy, right? What does it mean to have a car drive by itself? So it turns out actually a couple years ago, Nevada became the first state that actually allows the issue of an autonomous license for a driverless car, right? Because if you have an autonomous vehicle, you can't have necessarily a human, there could be a human in the car, obviously, if it's going somewhere. But how do you license it? And so Nevada became the first state. California has now done it too, right? That's why sometimes you see the self-driving cars driving around the roads. But one of the things that happens is this creates a lot of social issues, right? Because now we sort of think of the technology problem, and we're like, yeah, we built self-driving cars, that's great. Some of the social issues are good, some of them are a little worrisome, right? So some of the ones that are good are, you know, what does a car spend most of its time doing? Parked. It spends most of its time doing nothing, right? Like, what does my car do on most days? It drives for 15 minutes to get me to work. It sits there for 8 or 10 or 12 hours or whatever the case may be, and then it spends another 15 minutes taking me home, okay? And all the resources that had to go into that car are extremely underutilized because most of the time it spends its time doing nothing. So what if that car could be shared by a whole bunch of people? Right? I have a reliable means of having a car pick me up when I need to get to work and drop me off, and then it goes off and does a bunch of other things, and when I need to go home, there's another car there, may not be the same one, comes and picks me up and takes me home. Okay? We have some notion of that already. It's not a crazy idea. It's called buses. The problem with buses is they have very particular time schedules, and they have very particular stop and stop locations that you can get on or get off. But if you have a fleet of these kind of things, you basically take the notion of a bus and just make it ubiquitous. It can pick you up anywhere, it can drop you off anywhere, it can be available at any time. The other thing that kind of happens that's interesting, right, so we can save a whole bunch of resources now in terms of building cars, because we need to build a lot fewer of them potentially. The other thing is if you think about roads, what's most of the space on roads taken up by? Nothing, actually. Right? So if you think, if you're like, I'm on the highway, I'm driving 60 miles an hour. If you're on the highway, you're probably driving a little faster than 60 miles an hour, but we won't talk about that. So what is the DMV? Let's just say you listen to the DMV. They say there's supposed to be a car length between you and the next car for every 10 miles an hour. So what does that mean? Let's say you're driving 70. There's supposed to be 7 car lengths between you and the next car. Let's say you don't really pay attention to the DMV and there's 4. Okay? There's 4 car lengths of empty space between you and the next car. So what happens if you have a fleet of these things? Why do we have all that empty space, by the way? Because we're not so good at reacting. Right? It takes a while to realize the person in front of us is hitting the brake, and then for us to apply the brake and try to do that in a way in which our speed decelerates in conjunction with where they're decelerating so we don't smash into them. Okay? But if cars are driving themselves and they're all on a network and they can send back messages back and forth that says, you know what, I'm braking. Tell every car for the mile behind me that I'm braking, and they will all decelerate at the rates they need to decelerate. The amount of space you need between these cars is much smaller, because their reaction times are much faster and they can talk to each other, which human beings can't do from cars, and generally when they do, they're not being friendly, okay? So what do? You increase the capacity on roads by a factor of 3 or 4 without building any new roads. So suddenly transportation flows a lot more easily because we solve this technology problem that we didn't think necessarily had all these other ramifications. We get all these effects like cars can draft off each other. If they actually drive in formation, they save gas, right? So now we get energy savings because of this offshoot of this computational problem. Now there's flip sides to it too. I don't want to say everything's all great and happy, right? But to say that you can actually have real impact on a bunch of social issues like transportation, like energy, like safety, through computational problems, which are not necessarily the first thing that jumps into people's mind when they think about computation. The other thing about this is when it comes up to be that safety issue, right? Which is people say, you know what, I'm in a car. I'm trusting my life to the car. Like, you really want me to just say, like, it's going to drive now? Well, let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever been on a plane? Anyone? A few folks? Most of you. Did you fly the plane yourself? No. But there was one of you maybe flew the plane yourself. Most of you did not fly the plane yourself. Okay? So, but you're like, but there was a human being in the cockpit. What did that human being do most of the time? Nothing. They sat there and made sure all the, well, I shouldn't say they did nothing. They sat there and made sure everything was working right because autopilot was on. So you've already trusted your life in a transportation choice. You just weren't aware of it, or you weren't in the situation to fly the plane yourself, so you're willing to make that decision. For us, it's a little harder with cars, because you're like, I drive, and I want to drive. Okay? It's like, yeah, you might want to drive. Turns out, this thing's actually safer than you. Okay? And that's a hard thing for us to swallow. So Google's self-driving cars have actually been in a couple accidents, and the reason why they were in those accidents, because they drove too safely. And they actually did things that human drivers thought, well, you know, this person's going to just blast through the stop sign, or is going to come to a complete stop. Or it's like, well, actually, it's following the rules of the road. And when people are thinking other people are not going to follow the rules of the road, and that's how they behave, then you potentially create accidents. I mean, one of the things that actually got Sebastian to think about working on this problem was that a friend of his, when he was in high school, was killed in a car accident. Annually, about 1.2 million people die in car accidents. It's estimated if you could actually have this technology, it's not that you would get rid of all accidents, but you could potentially cut the number of fatalities in half. Right? So that's not to say it's foolproof. Foolproof shouldn't be the standard that we use for something like this. The standard for something like this is it needs to be better than us, and the truth is we're not very good at actually doing this task. We do it out of necessity, not because we're super good drivers. There are a few people in the world who are super good drivers. Most people are not the greatest drivers. Right? And if so you can save 600,000 lives a year, through computation, that's pretty cool. Please. Yeah, so car insurance is another big one. And that's another policy issue that needs to be figured out as well. And so one of the things that comes out of this, I think that's a great segue that leads into it is understanding science and technology isn't just about doing science and technology, it's about using it to impact the world. And if you decide you want to do something different than science and technology, understanding something about technology helps you make better choices for policy, like worrying about insurance or what are going to be the rules of the road or other things down the line. So let me tell you a couple personal stories along the way. So I was an undergrad at Stanford, that's where I started. And the first thing I will actually tell you is that if you feel insecure when you were at college, that is okay. I felt hugely insecure when I went to college. I was one of those kids that it was like when I got the little fat envelope from Stanford, I actually wasn't even going to apply. My guidance counselor said, why don't you just apply? And I was like, well, by the time I write for because there was pre-internet days, right? We don't just ask for or apply online or even ask for an application online. What you did was you wrote to the admissions office, they sent you back this thing that you filled out. So I said, there's no time, like if I write for the application, by the time I get it, I won't be able to fill it out. She said, I will call their admissions office and just get you the application, just apply. So I was like, okay. Applied, didn't expect to get in, fat envelope arrives, I'm like, okay, what have I got myself into? And decide to go, not being sure that, this is really, I'd never actually visited the campus before I showed up there for orientation. Not really sure that it was the place that, I could do well at, or, would I just struggle, what would happen? And within 24 hours of arriving, so I met my roommate, and my roommate had come to college still dating his college girlfriend. We won't talk about any of the issues there, okay? But interesting decision. And shows up, and so the first thing that happens, he's like, hey, let's go visit my girlfriend, she's in one of the other dorms, you can meet a roommate. It's like, sure. So we went over, met the roommate, and the roommate had already figured out her entire plan at Stanford. She was going to be a double major in music and physics, and she figured out her 4-year plan, and then, after telling me all this, she's like, have you figured out what you're going to do? I was like, I hear there's a course catalog, I should probably look at that. Right, because I had no concept. I was kind of interested in some math, science kind of stuff because I was kind of more of a math, science kid in high school. But then the other thing she did was there was this thing, now it's called the Intel Science Competition, then it was called the Westinghouse Science Competition, and she had been like one of the winners. I hadn't even entered because I didn't really know what it was, and she starts taking me page by page through her award-winning science project. And for an 18-year-old kid who's already insecure about being in college, you can imagine the insecurity meter just went through the roof, okay? And you know what? It's okay. It will turn out to be okay. And part of it is understanding that just because you're insecure doesn't make you any less capable, okay? So number 2, for me, college was about finding my passion. And that was one of the interesting things. Like now everything was an option, right? Like when I was in high school, there was like you have to take this, and then you have to take this, and there's maybe a couple options in there. And suddenly someone said like, well, relative to graduating, there's some requirements you got to do to graduate, but you can choose the thing you want to go into that you really love. And for me, I found computer science, and I was like, this is fantastic. So it's not like I'd done a whole, my high school didn't have a computer science class. Actually, it did. It was a class called computer science, but it was taught by one of the PE coaches. And it was really like a typing class on computers, so that was computer science. And I didn't even take it. So I show up at college, want to be the computer science major, right? Start by taking the introductory computer science class, which now I actually teach, and I tell all my students that. I'm like, I was in the same boat you were in 20 plus years ago. The plus part we'll just leave as a question mark. But that was the point. It was about finding a passion. I remember at one point it was late night one night in the dorms, and this friend of mine was talking to me about this class, and he's like, Mehran, you look kind of bummed out. Why are you bummed out? And I'm like, this class I was taking is over. And he's like, what? Are you crazy? Classes are over. Let's go out and party. And I was like, no, you don't understand. I love this class, and it's now over. And he gave me the weirdest look, and I was like, I found the thing I love. And he was like, I should use the mic. It was like falling in love with a subject. It wasn't quite the same sort of intimacy as falling in love with a person. That I'm willing to admit, but it's the place to explore and find that. When you find the thing that really gets you to want to get up and go do it, that's part of the whole exploration. And I didn't know that going in. I didn't know what was going to be that thing that was going to do it for me, and it was an opportunity to find it. So then it turned out I got a little bit involved in teaching while I was there, and I thought, hey, it'd be really interesting to pursue a career in teaching. And they told me, well, if you want to go be a college professor, you got to go to graduate school. It's like, okay, what's graduate school about? Right? And it's like research. Oh, well, that's different than teaching. Maybe I should get involved in research. So I started getting involved in research. And the idea was it was about tackling problems you haven't tackled before. And that was the thing that was both really scary about it, but was really refreshing and eye-opening. Rather than solving problems that people had solved before to learn something to show that you can solve that problem too, it was about there's problems out there we don't know how to solve. Go solve those problems. That's what research is about. And so it's incredibly frustrating and it's incredibly exhilarating. Because like you're working on something, sometimes you're working on something for a couple months and you're just making no progress at all and you're slamming your head on a bunch of things, and it is the slowest learning experience sometimes that you can imagine. Because you're like, I tried this and it didn't work, I tried this and it didn't work, I tried this and it didn't work. Is anything gonna work? And then in those moments where something actually works and you're like, wow, I got this thing to work that didn't exist before. That's pretty cool, and that will get you up the next day and go bang your head for a bunch of months on things that don't work until you get another one of those. People sometimes think of the psychology of that as like gambling. And so not that I want to draw the analogy to gambling, but like, a slot machine, what happens? Most of the time you're playing a slot machine, you're losing. Every once in a while you get a little win, and that makes you want to play more. That's like graduate school. But it was a ton of fun. It really was. I would probably say, just in terms of pure academic exhilaration, that was the funnest time in my life. Not that being a professor isn't fun. It is, but there's a whole bunch of other administration and stuff like that. That was just pure, just go for it, right? And it was staying up late nights and sleeping during, because I'm a late night kind of person, sleeping during the days, but it was just a ton of fun. And then after graduate school, I thought I was going to go be a professor. So I was all set to go off to some place that will remain nameless on the East Coast to be a professor. And this friend of mine, who actually is going to be one of the speakers in the series in a couple weeks from now, named George John, said, there's a startup company we're working on. Why don't you come check it out? And I was like, I want to go be a professor. And he's like, just come check it out. I was like, okay. You can notice there's many times in life where it's about someone saying, just come do this, right? And that's one of the things too. It's worthwhile to get advice, and most importantly to get mentors along the way. That made a huge difference, and you'll see that come up in a little bit. But the idea behind Epiphany was a piece of advice I got when I was all stressed out about what should I do for jobs and stuff like that. And someone gave me this little piece of advice. Ross Schachter, he was one of the professors I had at Stanford. He said, go to the place where you think you'll learn the most. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting piece of advice. That's very different than like some of the other pieces of advice that you sometimes get, like go to the place where you're going to get paid the most, or you're going to get the most senior job title or whatever. And he said, yeah, because no matter what happens, like the company could fail, it could become big, whatever happens, you'll learn stuff. And no one can take that away from you, and that will make you better prepared for the next step you want to take, because your career is not just your first job. Your career is a whole bunch of steps along the way, and the more you learn and the more you absorb, the better you will do in each one of those steps. I was like, that sounds like great advice. So I looked around at who was going to go to Epiphany, and it turned out like 5 of my good friends who I really would have loved to work with, 4 of them had already accepted job offers there, and I was like, all right, done. I'm just going to go do that. And so it was a lot of fun. And I was there for about 4 years. And then I was going to leave, and I was going to go to Stanford to teach. And around the time I was going to go to Stanford to teach, I got an email from a friend of mine from graduate school. Who said, we're doing this startup company. I hear you're leaving Epiphany. Why don't you come check it out? And I was like, I'm going to go teach. I'm going to be an academic. And this friend's name happened to be Sergey Brin. And he said, just come check it out. And I was like, okay, come check it out. So I went there, and I realized this was another piece of advice I got, which was surround yourself with people smarter than you. Okay? And for many people, that, especially someone who has like insecurity to begin with, that is a hugely difficult thing to do. Because if you're in an environment where you think everyone is smarter than you, you feel like, I'm the dumb guy, okay? And I don't belong here, and I can't do this. The inverse is actually true, which is that if you've surrounded yourself with people smarter than you, every day you are learning from every single one of them, okay? And that's the thing. You might notice a particular theme here. That's the thing that carries you forward. So part of that experience was saying, you know what, at that point, I was also old enough to be able to put a little of the insecurity aside and say, that's the thing I want to do. And the people I met there were just, I thought, were phenomenally smart. And they were nice people too. I think there's a lot to be said for spending time with nice people. And so I was like, all right, done. So I'm going to go there. Actually, there was this, I'll tell you this little side story. I'd already accepted a position at Stanford. And the last person I met with when I was chatting with folks at Google was Larry Page, who we were all friends in grad school. And so I said, Larry, I got to be honest with you. I already accepted this position at Stanford. Are you okay with that? And I was expecting him to be like, no, well, if you already accepted, because I was like, I'm not going to renege on it. Like, I believe in like the value of your word. So I told them, yes, I'm going to go. But I really want to do something with you guys. And expecting him to be like, well, that's not possible, come back in a couple of years or whatever. And he was like, oh yeah, it's great. We got a great relationship at Stanford. And I was like, what? That's not what I expected. So I ended up joining, and I was doing this crazy thing for a couple of years where I was actually full-time at Google and full-time at Stanford. I would not recommend that. The only reason it sort of worked out for a while is because my wife is just an unbelievable saint as a human being. And we made an agreement that when we were going to have kids, I would quit one of the jobs and just have a regular schedule. And she went along with that. And so when it was time to have kids, I always thought I would leave Google and go to Stanford. And interestingly enough, at the time our son was born, I ended up leaving Stanford and staying at Google. And then a couple of years later, because of the mentors that I had at Stanford who had helped foster me in teaching and research and stuff like that, this position opened up, which was the childhood dream job, which was the current position I'm in now. So I applied. And it wasn't like I applied a whole bunch of places or whatever. I was just like, I'm really happy at Google, but there's this position, I'll apply for it, and if it works out, I'll go back to Stanford, and if it doesn't, that's fine. And it happened to work out unexpectedly, and so I came back. And that's sort of I kind of think of it, we'll see what happens, but I kind of think of it as like this is the last job. And it's not that I'm particularly old, I'm not young either. But I think this is going to be the last job I have, because what I really think of this now as is the opportunity to give back. I had great teachers in high school and undergrad and graduate school. This is an opportunity to try my best to be a good teacher for other people. And so part of that is the students at Stanford. Part of it is actually a bunch of projects we do outside Stanford in education and in some other context. I'll tell you a little bit about some of those. But that was the opportunity to say, kind of in the end, looking at the path, I feel really lucky. And part of the reason I got really lucky was I had people along the way that just helped out. And that's one of the things that sometimes, people get to some place and they're like, oh yeah, I made it all by myself. No, totally not true. Okay? There was a ton of people along the way that had a huge impact on me as a person in terms of my career, in terms of decision making. And so the way I think about it is the best thing I can do is to try to provide that to other people along the way. So let's come back to computing. Computing is one of the things I like to think, tell my students is a growth accelerant. And they're like, what do you mean by growth accelerant? Well, let me show you a couple pictures. This is Google back in the early days. This was almost 20 years ago, 1997. This is actually a room at the Gates Computer Science Building at Stanford. And if you see something up here that looks like it's made out of Legos, that's because it is made out of Legos. So Larry and Sergey, when they were building the initial version of the search engine, they ran out of hard drive bays for all the documents they were crawling on the web. So Larry, in an amazing feat of engineering, built a square box out of Legos and put some fans in it and put a couple hard drives in it, and that's what housed Google. And if you really care about seeing that, it is now like a museum piece. It's actually like behind glass in the Huang Engineering Building at Stanford. It's like, oh, here's the original. You're like, it's Legos. And you're like, yeah, but it's the original Google. So that's 1997. Here's what it looked like. It was google.stanford.edu. And you can see that the page is not all that different now, except it just looks a lot sleeker, because graduate students in computer science should not do graphic design. But it's got the same search box, it's got the same colors. And here's the interesting thing. When I found this picture, I got this picture when I was working at Google. It said the index contains about 25 million pages. The index is how many pages when you put in a search are actually searched by the search engine to give you results. And this is back in like 1997, 1998. So the last year Google put out publicly the numbers about how big their search engine was 10 years later, it was in 2007. Anyone know how big the index, how many pages were actually crawled by Google's system? Yeah, it was billions. It was basically 1,000 times this number. It's about 20 billion, right? And that gave me a little pause, because if you sort of think about it, what in 10 years' time is increased by a factor of 1,000? Virtually nothing, right? We don't travel 1,000 times faster. That'd be kind of cool, but we're now nowhere near that. We don't produce 1,000 times as much food. We don't produce 1,000 times more energy, but we have 1,000 times more information available to us at our fingertips by typing a few keys at a keyboard because of information technology. And that's the power that STEM has, that technology has, is an accelerant that moves things faster than pretty much anything else in the world. Let me give you another example. This one might be a little hard to see with the lights up. I don't know if there's a way to dim the lights a little bit, but if not, hopefully you can make it out. What these lights represent is their amount of queries coming to Google in one day of the year. So the more queries that come from a particular location of the world, the lighter it gets. Okay? There's a couple phenomena that you see in here. First of all, you actually know where all the continents are. I didn't draw them. You can see where they are just based on people's information needs, right? Humans are information creatures, informivores, some people like to call us. And so our information need basically shows us where we're located. The other thing you can sort of tell is you're like, why is there this sweeping effect? What is the sweeping effect that's going on? Yeah, it's the rotation of the planet. Why? Because people go to sleep at night. Some of them do anyway. Tokyo does not, by the way. There's Tokyo. It's just yeah. And the Bay Area. At least it dims. The Bay Area dims. Like Tokyo doesn't even dim. But as the planet rotates, people go to sleep, and they don't query as much when they're asleep as when they're awake. And that's an interesting thing, to be able to see those kind of phenomena about the world as a whole by looking at information usage. There's also a bunch of other things you see that are pretty stark realities in terms of social and economic aspects of information technology. There's wide swaths of the world that just don't have any access at all.
Africa?
Exactly. And that's one of the things that we think about, right? Part of the reason of looking at something like this is not just, oh, it's kind of cool, but is there's people in the world who are on the other side of the digital divide, and what are the things we can do to help bring them over, right? And that becomes not only a social issue, but a technology issue. So let me ask you a question. What's a defining characteristic of China and India? Population, right? They are the two largest countries on the planet. They are also the last two countries on the planet that had a population greater than that of Facebook until last year. Right? So if you look at the numbers, the user base of Facebook is, well, actually it's even a little larger now, 1.5 billion users, or regular users. And the largest country on Earth is China, with a population of roughly 1.4 billion. Right? So if you think about how long Facebook existed as an entity, it was less than 15 years. Okay? In 15 years' time, it was possible to create a network of people that is larger than any country on the planet, because information technology has an acceleration effect that outpaces pretty much everything else. Okay? So that's the kind of power you have at your disposal by thinking about diving into technology and using it. And I would really like to think of what's the driver of all this innovation? What makes it happen? Curiosity. Who has that curiosity? You do, right? This isn't stuff that just like magically happens in some room someplace. It's driven by people. It's driven by people who have the skills and ideas to be able to turn things into some particular piece of technology that brings people together, that saves people's lives, that lets them see the world in a different way. And so one of the things is this huge need for computer scientists. Actually, right before the talk, I was talking to your dean a little bit about this. Is also the huge need for educators in computer science. So nothing is more interesting at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon than statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I know this is the highlight of the talk, so let me just get these out of the way. So, you know, what the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, I'm sure they do a lot of things, but one of the things they do is they put out pretty graphs. And one of the things they show in those pretty graphs is how many people are expected to graduate in a particular area versus how many jobs are in those areas, and projecting it out years into the future. Okay? So here's mathematics and physical sciences, right? There are some number of grads, and there are some number of jobs, just somewhat proportional to the number of grads. But if you see that and you're like, oh, I'm sad because I'm thinking about doing math, you have no reason to be sad. Here's the reason why you don't have to be sad, because here's what computing looks like. Yeah. So what happens to like the math folks who are not doing, I mean, how many people do you know who know to do math as their daily job? There aren't a lot. right? Like, how many people do physics? There's a couple of people who raise their hand. Like, whenever I ask this with like professors in the room, they're like, well, I do math on a daily basis. Yeah, and they're over here in the yellow. But guess what happens? It's not like these folks don't find jobs. They're coming over here because there's 3 times as many jobs as there are graduates. Okay? And guess what happens to the physicists who aren't doing physics? Because there aren't that many people doing physics on a daily basis. They're over here too. And if you take all those people and stack them over here, you get about that high. Which means the majority of people filling those jobs don't actually have training in computing. Like, whoa, that's a problem. Yeah. And you wonder why, like, your credit card numbers get stolen online, right? There is a huge need for people with these skills, right? And so it's this sort of win-win that there's a huge need and the impact you can have is amazing, right? So that's kind of, I won't bore you with more details of statistics. If you really want statistics, come talk to me after. One of the other classes I teach, actually I'm teaching at this course, a class on probability. But let me save you the pain of statistics. So when we thought about this in computing, we thought, well, how do we create this awareness of computer science in the large, right? Computing isn't just about learning how to program. It's about thinking about how the things you build have an impact in the world, and the fact that computing is increasingly needed for work in other fields. There's people now who are trying to cure cancer as a computational problem. Like, well, how do they do that? Well, they get a whole bunch of data about things like cancer, and they analyze genomes, and they understand, for example, what kinds of DNA cells shed when someone has cancer, and they build computational mechanisms for trying to understand that so that you can potentially detect it earlier, and you can treat it more effectively, and you can do a better job at saving people's lives. And they do that as a computational problem, right? They work with biologists. They need to know something about biology, and so things happen much more collaboratively these days, but that's what they do. And so it's about the social impact. It's not just about, around these parts, it's a little too easy to think of computing. Oh yeah, that's what people do when they want to build like a new app on this thing and then hope their app becomes a hit on the store. Yeah, that's fine. I don't begrudge folks who want to do that. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But at the same time, there's people who are trying to save millions of lives around the planet through computing. And so that's the thing that we wanted to get across to our students is that what's the context, right? Programming is a means. I don't know anyone who says, all I want to do is program. I don't really care if I'm building missile guidance systems or I'm building Flappy Birds. I just want to program, right? Most people care about the thing that they are programming. They care about the end. And programming by itself isn't the end. It is the means to get you there. What it's really about is about empowerment. It's to give you the skills to be able to go and tackle all these big problems, right? But it's just one of the steps along the way to be able to do it. And that's one of the big reasons why I advocate actually learning about technology, both for people who already know they want to do STEM stuff, but even for people who don't think they necessarily want to do it, because if they want to go make policy, if they want to work on human health, understanding something about computing will carry them a long way in that regard. Okay? So one of the things I talked about is education, sort of with these ideas in mind of thinking about the broad scale of education. Every decade there's these major computer societies, ACM and IEEE. Anyone here members? No one? You should start a chapter, have some members. It's a good time. It's also cheaper when you're a student, but I won't plug that. Which creates a set of guidelines around undergraduate college program curricula. What should colleges teach in computer science? And it's internationally recognized, so there's a bunch of people around the world who adopt it. I got roped into doing this a few years back, and we put out the final report in December 2013, so it's called CS 2013. And the theme is about the big tenets of computer science. It's about computing has an impact in the world at large. Computing is a means to an end. Programming is a means to an end, but you want to think about students understanding what is the end they want to achieve and getting the empowerment through computing and what are sort of then the technical details for getting there. And this has been sort of influencing universities and institutions sort of around the world, which is nice to see that someone actually read it because it was a bunch of years of my life, but that's not important right now. What is important is there's a bunch of career paths. I'm sure you have, career guidance here that is far more than I can give you in a slide. And many of these you already know, right? There's lots of directions you can go with STEM education, research and development if you actually want to go and do the technology, or do management, whether that's managing people, building stuff as an engineering management, or managing products. Obviously in this area there's a lot of entrepreneurship going on, I won't belabor that point. But also combining that with other kinds of training, right? Going and being a teacher, going to graduate school and going into academia or doing research or doing teaching. Think about intellectual property, which has become, and security and privacy, which are huge now. And thinking about the combination of law and computing. And business school is another route that students go. So to wrap up and leave some time for questions, I'll just leave you with a final thought. And the final thought is that progress is not a given. Many of the students that I talk to a lot of times feel like, oh, all this stuff's going on, I have no power over it, it's just going to happen. I say no. It happens because it's of people like you, right? It's not guaranteed to take place unless people want to do it. There's no one else who's going to solve the problem you care about necessarily, so you can't just relegate progress to someone else. The only reason it happens is because there's dedicated people who say, that's the problem I care about, and I'm going to learn what I need to learn to go actually solve that thing. So I leave you with a final quote with one of my personal heroes, which is, you must be the change you want to see in the world. And so with that, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you. Please.
What programming language would you recommend for someone to start when they're beginning computer science?
That's a good question. We were just actually having a discussion about that here. I think there's a lot, so I'll give you sort of the nuts and bolts answer, and I'll give you the sort of high level answer. The nuts and bolts answer is there's a bunch of languages that get used fairly heavily industrially. So Java, C, C++. These days you see more JavaScript, some other Python's starting to rear its head. So any of those languages is actually a reasonable language. You'll have lots of you'll learn a lot just about programming in general and lots of opportunities for application. Sort of the higher level concept is there's a lot of concepts that are actually not necessarily in the details of the programming language, but a lot of concepts around good software engineering that transcend the language. So like I teach our introductory programming class, and I actually started teaching it many years ago when it was in Pascal. Then I taught it when it was in C. Now I teach it and it's in Java. And the main difference is, the nuts and bolts of the language. It's like, okay, here we have references, here we have pointers, here we have something else. But in terms of the concepts, things like modularity, code reuse, documentation, stepwise refinement, decomposition, information hiding, all those concepts have remained the same across all those languages for 20 years. So those are the things that really change, I think, the notion of programming, the notion of software engineering, and that's why I'd say it's important to think about those concepts in addition to the choice of the language. Please.
What advice would you give to a person who aspires to study computer science at Stanford?
That's a good question. So there's again the nuts and bolts parts of it, which are do well academically, because there's a bunch of things when you apply for admissions, right? They're going to want to see your grades. They're going to want letters of recommendation. Part of that's related to letters of recommendation, but part of it is about what the admissions office always says is we want to see people with passion. And I've tried to go and talk to our admissions office, and to be honest, it's interesting. Faculty are actually not involved in decisions for undergraduate admissions or transfers. They don't, and I was like, when that happened, I went and I was like, hey, can I help you out with admission? And they were like, no. I was like, what? Like, faculty have no time, and some faculty member just showed up to your office and is like, I want to help, and they're like, nope. And I said, why? And then so at first I was like offended, and then the answer totally made sense, and they said, we don't want you involved in admissions because we're trying to admit a group of students across the university, and if you come in, you're going to be advocating for people in your area, and that's going to unbalance the university. It's like, okay, you got a legitimate point, I can buy that. So I don't know the details of the process, but in terms of passion, one of the things they want to see is, have you done stuff to distinguish yourself, not necessarily only in coursework, but in things beyond it? Are there activities you got involved in? Were there robotics clubs? Were there contests that you entered? Were there ways that you distinguished yourself? And that can be a bunch of different things. Did you contribute to open source projects, right? That shows that this is something that you really care about more than just classes. I mean, classes are important, and getting good grades is probably one of the highest things on the list. But then it's the other things that distinguish you from other people that may have gotten good grades as well.
I know Stanford has some online courses now. Is that available to high
Yeah, so there's two sets of stuff that's available. So one is actually, there's some of the MOOCs, massive open online courses, that anyone can enroll in. That would include high school students. I think there's actually some age restriction based on legal requirements. I think you might have to be 13 or something. But those are open to anyone, and they have a bunch of online assessments. And they're not necessarily the same as the classes at Stanford, but it gives you a sense of what's the instruction like, some of the topics, and so there's a pretty big list of those. And those are ones you actually sign up for. There's another set of stuff out there where you don't sign up for it, it's just materials that are available online. So like our introductory programming course, actually the first 3 courses in our sequence, the Java course, there's a C++ course, and the C course, are all available freely online. So all the videos are on YouTube. There's a site you can download all the materials, like all the assignments and stuff like that. Not that it's fun to do assignments, but that's the best way to learn it, right, is doing this stuff. That's all free. But it's not actually a course that you enroll in. There's no pacing, there's no help. That's probably the bigger thing, but it's available.
What's your favorite computer science or data structure textbook?
Oh, that's a good question. I need to think about that for a little bit. There are some books, there's a part of me that's just kind of sarcastic, and so some of the head first books I like just because they're sort of written in this irreverent style. But I'd say one of the books that sort of was a book I'd say that kind of, for lack of a better way to describe it, unscrewed my head, turned it upside down, and re-screwed it back on. It just gave me a different way of looking at the world. It was actually a math book written by Don Knuth, who's considered sort of the father of algorithms or father of modern computer science, who's actually a professor at Stanford. He's retired. I'll tell you the story. When I first showed up, there was a faculty member. I actually took my copy of one of his books and went into his office to get him to sign it. And it was like being like a little, it's like, you're a faculty member, right? And I'm like, yeah, but I'm a big fan. Can you sign it? But it's just a book. It's called Concrete Mathematics. And it's a book that brings together sort of ideas from discrete math and ideas from calculus and applies them in computer science. And it's just extremely eye-opening with respect to these funky approaches to problems.
How do you bridge the gap for people who aren't necessarily computer savvy, but have expectations of it to just work?
And have expectations of it at work?
Yeah, just work as this.
Yeah, so what I would say is these days there's gotten to be more online resources that are really good. And it doesn't mean you have to take a whole class. It doesn't mean that you have to, get into the field to become a software developer. But there's a lot of things that give you a taste for what programming involves and actually help you get through some of the initial stages just to sort of think about what's possible to do and what programming really is that are more user-friendly, I would say, these days. So one place to start, for example, is there's this organization called code.org that has the Hour of Code. And so some of the stuff they have, they try to make it accessible for kids, so they make it look like Star Wars characters or Frozen characters or whatever. But they're applicable for anyone to think about what are some of the concepts in computing. And from there, they actually have a whole curriculum that leads into learning Java and a bunch of other things that you can do online for free. And so I'm a big fan of stuff like that. I think there's structured education, which I think is really important. At the same time, I see a lot of people just with passion who will go and learn very well in unstructured environments as well. And I think the combination of those two is really the best.
I guess as a computer science major who is interested in going to the field of artificial intelligence, what would be like the basis of trying to get into that field right now?
Sure. So in AI right now, probably the biggest subfield is an area called machine learning, which has just gotten huge. So my PhD was actually in machine learning like 20 odd years ago when machine learning was like, you would say that and people would be like, what is that? And now it's a weird thing that it's sort of percolated into popular culture. Part of it is really what machine learning is underneath the hood is it's pretty much just a combination of math and statistics with some algorithms on it to be able to do data analytics and stuff like that. And so being comfortable with some of the underlying math and sort of the two forms of math I put the biggest emphasis on. One is probability theory, which sounds a little bit weird because most people like computers. Why is that probabilistic, right? Like they do the same thing over and over. And it turns out that it's not that computers are doing things differently, it's that a lot of concepts from probability are the concepts that are used in the algorithms for building models of data and doing machine learning. And then the other one is linear algebra. So, calculus has some role. To be honest, that form of math is not the most commonly used math in computing. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean it's not part of degree requirements, right? At Stanford, we actually require a year of calculus and then 1/4 of linear algebra, even though the linear algebra is probably the thing that's used more. And that's more for historical reasons than anything else.
So, being that you were at Google and Stanford, how do you think that virtual reality could actually assist STEM learning environments, and in the combination of the Internet of Humans and Internet of Things, and sort of the awesome things you saw like at Dreamforce, all these companies coming together for like innovation, for benefiting communities?
Yeah, so I think one of the places that virtual reality has applicability in learning environments is helping create more of the social environment for people who may not otherwise have access to the social environment, right? So there's actually something special about coming to a place like a college and taking a class with other people, and part of that has to do with what the person in front of the board is talking about, i.e. what you're supposed to be learning in the class, and part of it has to do with what's going on with all the people in the group who are learning from each other. Like if you're doing study groups, you're asking questions, you're just talking in the hallways, whatever the case may be. And that's something about the education process that is not fully appreciated. And I think what virtual environments provide is they provide more of an opportunity to be able to do that with people who aren't physically connected. Right? I'm more likely to actually go watch the videos online if someone tells me there's a classroom and I need to be there at 9 o'clock. And it's entirely a virtual classroom. But when I show up there, I know all my other virtual friends are there. And if I'm actually immersed in a virtual environment, after the class or even during the class, I can turn to them and chat about stuff that's going on in this thing that's supposed to be a class. And now it becomes a two-way means of communication instead of just me watching a video stream.
Nice.
Thanks very much.
So we just want to give a round of applause for the speaker.